Yeah, hi. Those that know me know I can't stand still, so which is why they have to wire up these. And I have to check the back so I don't fall off into it. And thank you, Mark, who lent me a pen as I was digging through my bag looking for a pen. And apparently it rubs out. So hopefully I'll rub out a few PowerPoints as we go through. My pleasure to be here, Caroline Saunders, and I acknowledge Paul Dalziel, who helped put some of this work together with me, but couldn't be here today. AERU, we've had our 50th birthday a couple of years ago, independent, externally funded research unit based at Lincoln University. We get up to quite a bit of mischief and have worked with many of you in the room, so thank you for that. Three particular pieces of work I want to talk to you today. One is the economic futures work we're doing with the Ministry of Transport and MB, and there's two bits to that. One is an update and looking at overseas best practice in inverted commas. I don't think there is such a thing as best practice, overseas practice in economic development and how we can relay, and that focuses on New Zealand. And then the other piece of that work, which is looking, if we reach utopia in New Zealand, these sort of targets we talk that we want to be like, such as equal with Australia or higher than Australia or whatever, what does that look like? What would the economy look like if we achieved some of these, and how do we achieve it? Is it through increasing knowledge economy? Is it through increasing different sectors? So I'll take you on that. And sandwiched in between is a piece of work that I've been working on for years, passionate in New Zealand, that we engage with the global communities and obtain the true value of our products and what we do overseas in our overseas markets, and show you some of that work. Okay. Can't press a button, there we go. In the international growth theory, this slide here is pretty much where New Zealand's been since '84. It's sort of saying, let's have people-based economic development. The market will decide where we're at, where we're going, and that we can sort of, as long as we make sure the market's enhanced, we've got a good macroeconomic environment, we look after businesses, the economy will be hunky-dory. And New Zealand has a really good record in this space, cutting edge, with the Reserve Bank Act, Fiscal Responsibility Acts, internationally, and it has a very good record of being business-friendly. But nonetheless, New Zealand still has fallen down the OECD, whatever rankings we want to look at, in terms of our growth. So how successful has it been? I guess we can question. Oh, if you've got to really press this button. No? It's not. Here we go. And then we can look at the other side of theory, which is a bit more place-based, looking at where does this development take place, and does it matter? And one of the sort of theories behind that is not an either-or theory, is agglomeration. That, especially we've got knowledge-based societies, agglomeration becomes more and more important because people want to talk to each other. Although there is some new evidence coming out that given how people are interacting with modern media, this is becoming less important. And so should we all move to Auckland and leave the rest of the country sort of behind? Or, you know, there's talk about should we sort of look at Christchurch, Wellington, Auckland, and there's all kinds of debates in that space. Well, one of the sort of things to remember is that when they talk about agglomeration in this literature, they're talking about cities that at least are 2 to 3 times as big as Auckland, at least. So we're talking the Londons, the Milans, the New Yorks. And even so, even if, you know, and I'm not against that we should have agglomeration in Auckland or look at Auckland, but don't ignore the regions, is the other message from this literature, because whilst the highest growth rates may come from those big cities, those big agglomerations, most of the growth comes from the other regions. So if you miss that, you're missing a lot of potential in your world economy or even your... What does it mean for New Zealand, and how do these growth models sort of, when we start putting a New Zealand lens on them? Well, the argument goes that small countries like New Zealand don't have the scale to be generic and follow the economic growth path. They've got to be a lot more strategic and specialise. And one of the big arguments that I will stand behind, and you'll see when I get to the next part of the talk, is that we've got a relatively poor performance compared to other small countries globally. And it's because we're isolated, not much, a bit of an excuse, but we've got an outdated view of the global economy, and we need to be more strategic. And that's what I'll pick up in some of the research we're doing again. It's sharp. So, if we want to maintain and grow our regions, our economy, whether we call it well-being, we need to concentrate on being high value and not low cost. And I tell you, it really pisses me off when I go, I talk a lot to the big companies, the big sectors, mainly a lot of them, the high-tech, but also mainly the agricultural companies. And, oh, we're a low-cost producer. Nothing in New Zealand should be a low-cost producer. We should be a high-value producer. I love you. Somebody, yeah. Only about 3 claps, you know, but it's a start. It's a start. So I have a passion out there that I trip up and down the boards and annoy anybody who'll listen, including you today, that not an ounce of commodity product should leave New Zealand at a commodity price. Yeah. Got it? And we work on biscuits and we work on those kind of things, but I'm talking even a sack of milk powder. It's not necessarily that we have to convert everything into a biscuit there. So we need to see what our markets want and segment them and give it them. Respect the consumer. Look out there and play to our wonderful specialities, both regionally and nationally. Well, being the idiot I am, I thought I had the knack. Nope. These are some of the kind of things we look into when we're looking in overseas markets and seeing what do they want, what will they pay. Each one means something different in each market. Respect it. Think about it. Not greenwash, but meet those particular ones. Some come and go as fashions. Others are a little bit more enduring. And so we're sort of in the unit watching all the time what's going on those. But then I go and talk to some of these big companies, and some of the messages I get is, shut up, Caroline, get back in your box. We're going to feed China and India and the world, and they don't care how the food's produced. And you, Caroline, you might tell, I'm a POM, you're so UK-centric, only they care about that stuff, and we don't care about the UK anymore. And, you sort of come across this culture of we're going to take orders and the growth that way. So I thought, let's go and find out. Let's keep the conversation going and see if they're right. So we went out a little while ago with some pilot research. And we asked for consumers in the UK, India and China about the attributes of food, things that they thought were important. This slide, no surprises. So if I take this and I trot it up and down the country to big boards and the major sort of suppliers, no surprise here, everybody likes fresh food. Everybody likes a bit of tasty food. The blue bars are the very important ones. We all like a bit of quality. Price, well, done that. Brand, well, there's a theme. The UK's got a relatively safe supply chain. Brand may not be that important. No surprises. Then the next slide. They didn't tell me the stage, but there. Well, maybe I should do this side and stop being biased. Oh, no, I can't, because Ganesh is in the way. Then we looked at different attributes, and we went food safety. Well, again, it's not surprising the UK doesn't mind as much because it's got a safe supply chain. Country of origin, same reasoning. But it's from this point onwards that the eyes start popping out. Now look at recyclable. The UK way below India and China. And if Japan was on there, Japan's off the radar screen for that one. Animal welfare. I thought all the POMs were little doggy-hugging people. And you might expect high for India, but China. And then certified environmental quality, wow. And the UK is supposed to be the one that deals with that. There are more results, and we are redoing this project now, and it's, we have got preliminary results out. We're doing Indonesia, China, India, Japan, Korea, UK, and it's really reinforcing because we're going into these in more depth. And then we went out again and said, well, let's try and put some values to that. And I know typical academics, just a slide up with too many ready numbers on it. 2 things to notice, though. One is just look at the percentages in the UK column compared to India and China. They're a lot lower. You say, is this true? Well, we know some of these are totally underestimated compared to what is actually happening in markets. And the other one is, look at New Zealand. China loves foreign food, we know that, but really loves New Zealand food. Every ounce of New Zealand product into China should get at least that. And we're sort of finding that we tend to get about 10% of it, and there are certain companies like Zespri that get more than that. India doesn't like foreign food, but likes New Zealand food. So, you know, it's trying to get these messages out that there's a real premium and make sure we get it down the value chain for New Zealand. So we have the 3-year project doing this. And the other thing I get told is, oh, we're ingredient suppliers. And this might interest you. I always have this fantasy that something I'm saying might interest the audience. but you know, you guys are sort of local government, passionate about your local regions, wondering what to do and feeling a bit disempowered. And then I get this thrown back at me, oh, we're ingredient suppliers, Caroline. Nobody gives a toss. They don't know it's New Zealand or that type of stuff. So what we're doing in this is looking at alternate media and the use of alternate media to getting into market. And it's fascinating results. I could take you through all the boring stuff that we're getting out. So we're getting some snippets in. I've still not got the knack. I'll be stomping on it soon, so I'm going to ignore that one. Just the kind of things like this. That's a billboard in the underground, South Korea. And that guy there's doing his shoppings with a QR code. Just clicking on the products, they'll be delivered to his home. So it's a billboard. I think it's amazing. So just trying to think out of the box of how to get your products out there. And here's some snippets from the pilot survey. Just looking, and it astounded me because, you know, sometimes purchased food, India 33%, a smartphone. UK 5%. Different world. Use social media, web pages for information on food. India off the radar screen, UK barely even looks at it. Online food purchase, India, 35%, UK 19%. And why? One of the Indian ones is a very high reason because it can get overseas food. So it's trying to think out of the box of getting the products from your regions into market without, with a bit more empowerment for your producers and your firms. Okay, so what would, if we had this wonderful future that I dream of, what would that look like? And so with MOT and MB, we have a project doing of looking at what some of these economic futures might be, built on the literature and built of some of the experience I've just been talking about. And that's our first 2 arrows. I've tried left, I've tried right, I've tried... And so we're going to run some alternate scenarios, and these are in 2042, looking backwards. There's a baseline, which we're going to compare the others to. And the baseline, we're using basically Treasury and Stats New Zealand projections, taking them out a little bit further, just as a base to sort of run against. And then we're going to put some different sort of lenses across that. It's not definitive. We're not saying this is how the world should be or anything. It's just to try and look at what that would be, what it would mean, how it would affect the regions, and how it would affect New Zealand. The first one, which is first two, are sort of nice to explain because they're pretty obvious. So we up the Canterbury irrigation, or we have a look at increasing agricultural output, and then run that through our modelling and see what that looks like and what the impact of that is in 2042. Then, of course, our ministry colleagues of transport come in and look at the transport implications. And I don't pretend to have anything to do with that because what I know about transport could leave space on a postage stamp. Then there's the mineral exploration one. For example, what happens if Gisborne opens up its offshore field? What's the implications of that? But the ones I'm really interested in are the ones where we look at some of these aspirational targets and what does that mean? It might be the business growth agenda. What happens if we do get to 40% of exports in the economy? Which sectors do we need to grow to meet that? What would it look like? Or what would happen if we increase the knowledge base in our economy? How many more degrees would we need? How many more diplomas? What are the level of qualifications of people? And we're putting across that a location lens. That it all goes to Auckland. I'm exaggerating slightly. Nearly there. Sorry? Oh, it won't take that long. You can relax. Then we're looking at the 3 golden triangles. There's another one. As I said, the golden triangle, of course, of Christchurch first, Auckland second, and then Wellington third. And then a market towns one. And it's interesting, some of the literature shows that, and you've seen evidence of this, that with a knowledge-based economy, particularly a country like New Zealand, people love going to where the sun is, some beautiful places like Napier, Nelson, oh, that's where we are, Queenstown, Southern Lakes, places like that. So we're looking at some alternatives there. Let's go through that. And to help us do these, we're picking up on a model that I know Tom Hooper's here, that we jointly developed with CDC, so thank you, Tom, looking at how we might select those sectors. And this model's based on a reasonable amount of data that looks at the sectors that have got the potential for growth, that we've got international opportunities in New Zealand, we've got a competitive advantage, so our value added is competitive to our competitors. I love it. I sometimes get involved in economic development work. I'm led out of Lincoln, and I had a fantastic time in Ashburton once. I hope there's nobody here from Ashburton. I bet there is. And I said, think outside the box. What would you love? That kind of thing. Space station. So just watch it. You know, and soon a space station. Well, maybe we didn't quite have the competitive advantage for that, but you never know. Potential for market growth, then the contribution to the economy, whether it's a regional economy or the national economy, up, down and upstream effects, and how profitable and productive it is. Put alongside that, have we got a profile and history of it? Because that should strengthen what you do. For example, when we were running this through, we probably wouldn't be producing any sheep because it was looking pretty horrible overseas. And what are your sources? And then you bring alongside what your enablers to get there. Some of the evidence, we were looking at the growth figures that you're probably much more familiar with than I have. Even before the earthquakes, dear old Canterbury was growing GDP faster than the other 3 regions. Just had to put that in, didn't I? And then here's some of the sectors that have got really excellent growth rates. Professional services, and in fact that came out top in its own right when we ran this through for any region, but Canterbury in particular, with big returns, big growth rates, and this is professional services, consulting, research, science, all the things that we actually have some really strong competitive advantages in. So, regional government, your strategy to assess what are the special strengths of your region. What are you good at and passionate about? What would be really worth you guys facilitating and helping along? I'm not saying you pick winners, but think about what's strong and how to facilitate it. How does that fit into the global economy? How can we ensure that you get the true representative value for what you're doing back into your communities? And then how do we facilitate that development? It might be through skills development. It might be through bringing in business services, as many of you do, and all kinds of different activities in that space. And just the last slide is a commercial with honour to Paul, who did all the work and I got all the glory. We've just completed a book. 2 copies with me, don't rush at once. Looking at this in a broader context, sort of looking at what we call well-being economics, which stresses the consumption side, which says the well-being, the benefits to the communities, and looking at these value-added activities as apart from low-cost activities. It never astounds me that when I'm talking to some businesses who remain nameless, they say, we want low-cost labour, we want a low cost. How can we reach the GDP or the income of Australia if we're having low-cost workers? We can't, unless you want a very inequitable society. And, of course, this also has a section on local government or the advantages local government has in adding value to ourselves, our societies and communities. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you, Fran, for the precise introduction. I hate the introductions that go on forever. I've been given the hurry up. Hopefully I won't stand between you and afternoon tea because that's important. So apologies if this seems a little bit unstructured. I was given the title about future economic thinking, and I hesitated because my concern is that if you're wanting to think about the future, the last people you want to talk to is a bunch of economists. I'm concerned that I'm the third of 3 economists up here today. I will say bluntly and openly that part of our problem as a nation is that we take a lot of advice from people who claim to be economists. And I'm saying this openly and honestly, except I haven't heard any of those economists actually apologise for having got it so badly wrong over the last few years. So I openly apologise for the economics profession. We've got a lot to answer for, but I also think we've got a lot to contribute. So I do apologise for what we've messed up in the last few years. And the the target I put in front of me is a quote that I'll take from about 1931 from a relatively famous economist from a long time ago, John Maynard Keynes. And he said, if economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent people on a level with dentists, that would be splendid. And I definitely don't want to cast any aspersions on any dentists in the audience, so hopefully you'll bear with me. Very quickly, if you haven't got the message already, the world is changing. Change has been a theme of several of the presentations before me today. And if you haven't got the message, it's changing fast. Modes of transport are going to change. We're going to have driverless cars very quickly if they're not already here. The bottom picture on the left has all got to do with climate change and minerals and mineral extraction. The finance markets, that's my dig at economists, or actually financial commentators that claim to be economists. The finance commentators, we've got to turn that around and actually having finance commentators being the subset of economic analysis. The global centres of the universe have changed and will change even further. And Shamabeel said already this morning, the world is moving a hell of a lot closer to New Zealand than it ever was, or moving back closer. We've got to take that as a plus. And of course, technology, who knows where technology is going to head into the future. Very quickly, yes, these buttons are a little bit interesting, aren't they? Go. Bluntly, and we hear a lot about the New Zealand economy having suffered substantial shocks over the last few years, negative shocks, whether it be the global financial crisis or the Christchurch earthquakes or other things. But what is a well-kept secret is that we have had in the last decade, if not more, the biggest positive shock that we've had for the last 40 odd years. That's our terms of trade. Very technically, it's the price of the things we sell divided by the price of the things we have to buy. And if it's going up, it should make life a hell of a lot easier for us. And it has. The terms of trade, if you haven't caught already, are now at a 40-year high. And that picture there goes over 90 years, so it's about the third highest for a 90-year history. So if we can't make it right out of that scenario, then we really have done something wrong. It's an opportunity of a generation, if not more. We are well positioned. This is the blunt instrument or the blunt signal that Caroline, etc., Caroline and others have been talking about in terms of markets changing, whether it's the markets, where they are or what they want. We are well positioned. We just got to figure out how we provide it to the benefit, not just of those consumers, but to us. And fully endorse Caroline's comment. We don't want to become a low-wage economy. It's got to be high value. And that message, or that picture out there is saying that people actually do want the value that we can provide. What else is next on my thing? Bluntly, back to Economics 101, get rid of the finances. We've got a bucket of resources out there and it's called wealth and it's not called GDP. Okay? GDP is a very, very poor measure, and I'll apologise for all the economists as well. I got taught when I was about that high, still about that high, when I did my first lesson of economics, that GDP was a very, very, very bad measure, and sooner or later there are a whole lot of economists are going to come up with a better measure, but in the meantime we'll continue using it. That was 35 years ago and we're still using GDP. There's something wrong. Demand from the economists and all your other official advisors some other measures as well to go with GDP. Whether those measures are the quality of the water in the river or the nutrients, or whether it's the quality of the schooling that we're providing our children, or whether it's the quality of the health services, or whether it's the road infrastructure or the communications, all of those sorts of things. GDP is just plain wrong. You take all of those into account, and that bucket of resources that we've got to play with in New Zealand is way much bigger than it was a long time ago. Way much bigger than my parents' generation inherited. So I don't buy the thing that New Zealand is poorer, or New Zealand is poor, and that we can't afford anything anymore. We're not poor. We're a hell of a lot wealthier than we inherited this place at. We've got choices to make, and this is blunt, this is Economics 101. The biggest choice, or biggest decision from an economist's perspective that we have to make is how much of those resources do we use today, and how much do we put aside for tomorrow? It's really that simple. Don't make it any more complicated than it is. And the reason we need to put resources away for tomorrow is because we need to invest in those resources to make sure they are just as productive, if not more productive, for the wealth that we pass on to the next generation. Interestingly, just think of the wealth generation over the last 40 years that was produced on the basis of a very poor generation of my parents who came here. And then think of what we've got to play with, and then we look at the excuse of, oh, it's too hard and we're poor. We can't afford to invest in our resources anymore. We're going to take some cheap options. That's the thought. Bluntly, we've got to be honest with our audience, whether they're ratepayers or whether they're taxpayers, or whether it's just plain NZ Inc. When are we going to put it out there right in front? And it's what Shamabia was talking about before also, about what is our vision, what is New Zealand wanting to look like over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Do we actually have a shared vision, or can't we be buggered and all we're interested in is lifting GDP next year? Bluntly, if we are interested in a future, then we've got to think carefully about what ratepayers, what regions, what groups of the population are going to be worse off this year because we want to make people better off the year after. That's the conversation we've got to have. Whether it's regions or, probably more interestingly, groups of people. And then we start thinking, well, why? What do we mean by lower returns? Because what you'll inevitably hear is many of those lower returns are just GDP returns. The other things will be different. We've got to broaden the conversation about returns. Bluntly, this idea, and I've got to talk about it, yes, I've got a few minutes. I've got to talk about this region stuff because that's critical for New Zealand going forward. This idea that Auckland versus the regions or other regions versus other regions, we've got to get past it. Bluntly, you ask my opinion, the discussion is between local government and central government. How much of these wealth and how much of the investment that we have got to put into maintaining resources across the regions, how much do we put on ratepayers and how much is a national burden? How much is going to benefit NZ Inc? And that's when I look at my ordinary model of the New Zealand economy, of any economy. We've got choices. Activities that make up an economy. We can plant, dig, grow and harvest stuff, or fish. You can all make up your own words. Then we can also be involved in processing stuff and making stuff, assembling, constructing. Or we've got some other things that we could do. Transport, we could actually create, we can sell, we can research stuff. Okay? And then out there, and we've got some other stuff that we have to do as businesses as well. We've got to have the lawyers and the accountants and the financiers looking after us as well. And there's one element in my economy that's missing, isn't there? We're also allowed to have some fun every now and again. One more picture. We do have to educate people. We have to entertain them as well. We've got to look after them. And we've got to house them. For those people who don't like words, here's some pictures. For those who don't know those, don't like the pictures, can't understand it, we've got primary industry, manufacturing industry, and then I don't like services all bunked together as one industry. I've got 3 sets of services. The top one I call market services, so that's the selling and the creating and the research. That's all meant to be the new sexy stuff we've got to do. Then the bottom one is business services, so that's the that's the lawyers and the accountants. And then there's me on my bike, the people services. Trying to keep healthy, trying to keep active, both in mind and body, as well as looking after everybody else in terms of health and community and schooling, etc., etc. The problem being, there are arrows in terms of relationships between all of those sectors, okay? And look carefully, all of those arrows are double jointed, are double directional, two directional arrows. They go in all directions. You can't have a manufacturing sector without a primary sector. You can't have a market services sector if there's no primary sector to service. You can't have business services if you haven't got people to service. And you can't have any of them unless you've got some healthy people who are skilled. Okay? Think about it. We all know that. And my job is to work out the value of all of those arrows. That's fun. But what does that mean in terms of regions? Well, think about where all of those sectors might be located if you're thinking of regional, town, country, hinterland, etc. Market services, business services, people. If you're thinking of a city town, you're probably going to capture a fair bit of something that looks something like that. Your economy's going to look something like that. A lot of market services, a lot of business services, some people services, and a little bit of manufacturing. Probably not much primary. So that economy is not sustainable on its own. If you're looking at a more town/region perspective, you're going to capture a few bits of extra, but you're going to need the city and the town to capture the business and the market and the people services that you haven't got. And then, of course, you've got NZ, hopefully bringing in all the best, all the rest. Which one of those squares or which one of those circles is most important? Now, if anybody wants to answer that question, you're either very brave or very silly. Okay? Get over it. New Zealand cannot exist, or regions cannot exist in isolation, just as industries can't exist in isolation. I'll get rid of that slide because that's boring. Sorry, I'm skipping through that one very quickly. My corollary for regions is we can look at it as a rugby game. It's a team, isn't it? There's 15 regions in New Zealand, roughly, depending upon how you divide up the cake. There's my front 5, tight 5. They're the big hitters. Why are they? They're the export earners, okay? Bluntly. If you haven't got a tight 5, then you're really in trouble. Okay? What else have we got behind them? Well, we got the harriers and the fast-moving, scurrying on the 2 flanks, and then we've got Auckland in the middle. And for anybody who think we can do without Auckland, just think about doing without a number 9 in your team. And if Auckland think they can do it without them, I'm not saying that, and if Auckland can think they can do it without us, just think of a number 9 without a front 5. Boy, are you vulnerable. Okay, scary. And then you've got the back line out there. You can argue with me as to where I put you, but that's my team, and you've got Wellington being the last line of defence. Okay? Go for it. One very last piece of information that I really want to put in front of you is that's that demographic stuff. I don't want to get too depressed about the demographics. Here's my cut on the demographics. We all know that New Zealand is going to grow, but most of it's going to be growing in Auckland. That's the picture that everybody shows you. Most of the growth in the New Zealand population over the next 10 years or so is going to be in Auckland. Take another slice of the pie, and this is what doesn't worry me, but interests me as a number geek, but it's also important from a regional development perspective. Don't forget, I just made the case that regions are important in the New Zealand economy, either last year, this year, or indefinitely next year, if not next generation. Most of the growth in the Māori population over the next 10 years is going to be out in the regions. okay, or for want of a better word, sorry, not out in the regions, that's a wrong phrase, outside of Auckland, okay? So if we are going to adopt as a nation a policy or a strategy that ignores the regions, then I don't want to be a part of it. Because A, it ignores our economic realities, and it ignores something about the demographics of New Zealand. And if I'm going to put a couple of slides up very quickly, I just look at some breaking down the demographics of outside of Auckland, and this is not saying that Auckland is not important, but as I put Auckland on the same graph, it swamps the story. So we know what's happening in Auckland, but do you know what's happening in your regions? In terms of the tamariki, this I'll put in front of the Ministry of Education, almost across the board, all of the growth in the regions for the young are in terms of growing numbers of Māori and declining numbers of non-Māori. I'll just leave that with you to think about. And I'll skip through that one, but the other one I'll put in front of you, the last slide I will put, second to last slide I will put in front of you. The 40 to 64-year-old age group, you can argue with me, but it's probably the bulk of this audience. The reason I put this in front is this, and it was alluded to earlier, this I term the glue that holds communities together. This is where you get the movers and shakers, the people who sit on councils, the people that sit on boards of trustees at schools, or the local sports club, or Rotary. And without exception, this is outside Auckland, without exception, in all of those regions across New Zealand, apologies, I haven't yet broken it down to individual TLA. Let's tell you, I know Ron was wanting me to do that earlier this morning, but I can do. Without exception, there is a net reduction in number of population in this age group in non-Māori, but a net increase in the number in this population in Māori. That to me says something about the regional economic development of New Zealand over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. If this continues, I don't know if it does, but I do know over the next 10 years we cannot afford to ignore the regions, if we are even thinking about it. But the regions are going to look different. The economic activity in the regions are going to look different. And yes, the demographics look, I won't say they look bleak, they look different. The world is going to change, but it's always changed. Let's just be aware of the change and make sure we use this sort of change to our advantage rather than always thinking that this is the end of the universe and we've got to close some regions down. I don't think we do, but I do know the region's going to be different. And let's not forget, despite our best efforts in terms of creative activities and despite our best efforts to increase the service exports component, the predominance of New Zealand exports coming out of the New Zealand economic system will remain in these areas. That's the reality. That's where the wealth of New Zealand lies. That's where it's been built up, and we'd be silly to lose that wealth. I'll leave that with you. Lots to think about. Sorry, no answers, but that's a humble economist talking. Thank you.